Bandits broke into an old man's house, but suddenly a wolf appeared. What happened next will shock everyone. An icy wind lashed fiercely at the weather-beaten faces of the three men, piercing through their tattered, stolen clothes, which were unable to protect them from the merciless breath of the November taiga. The stinging snow that had begun at dawn had now turned into a thick, blinding veil, obscuring their tracks and slowing their already exhausting run. Ahead, breathing heavily and slipping on frozen bumps, walked Kripley, a tall, bony man with deep-set eyes that held nothing but cold, calculating malice. His hand instinctively clenched the handle of a crude homemade knife tucked into his belt. He didn't look back. He knew that the other two, Schneer and Bick, were trailing behind, bound to him not only by a common goal, to survive and escape their pursuers, but also by fear of his relentless cruelty. For the third day, they had been fighting their way through this endless, gloomy forest since leaving behind the walls of the hated colony and the cold body of the guard who had cut off their path to freedom. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, turning into a dull, aching pain. And every rustle, every crack of a dry branch under their feet made them flinch, expecting the shout of their pursuers or the click of a gun. Horse stopped so abruptly that Bull, a clumsy giant with empty eyes, almost ran into him from behind. Sniff, small and nimble like his nickname, froze a little further away, pulling his head into his shoulders, his rat-like eyes darting restlessly from side to side. "Quiet," Whiskey hissed, his voice rough and sharp as the scraping of metal. He listened, tilting his head, trying to catch any sound through the howling wind, other than the moaning of the trees. The taiga was silent, keeping its secrets. But something had changed. A faint but persistent smell of smoke tickled their nostrils. Smoke. That meant shelter, warmth, food, perhaps danger. But right now the prospect of hot food and a roof over their heads outweighed any fear. Horse grinned predatorily, baring his few yellow teeth. "There." He waved his hand toward where a thin, almost ghostly column of smoke was barely visible through the snowstorm and the thick wall of fir trees. Maybe lumberjacks, or a lone hunter. Either way, we're in luck. His companions exchanged silent glances. Luck was a relative concept in their situation, but no one dared to argue with the horse one. He was their only chance of getting out of this icy hell, and they knew it. He moved forward again, more confidently this time, pushing his way through the bushes, his figure dissolving into the gray mist like an evil spirit of the forest. And the other two, after a moment's hesitation, followed him, driven by hope and fear. The taiga around them seemed hostile, its dark fir and pine trees, wrapped in snow, resembling silent guards watching over uninvited guests. Every step was difficult, the frozen ground offered no support, and their feet kept sinking into holes hidden under the snow or getting caught on roots. But the smell of smoke was becoming clearer, and this gave them strength, spurring them on like hunting dogs that had caught the scent of their prey. A hoarse voice inside them told them that ahead of them lay not just shelter, but a chance to turn their desperate situation around. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. Yegor Matveyevich sat by the hot stove, listening to the wind whistling in the chimney and the dry logs crackling. His old, calloused hands were busily mending a torn net, a task he had inherited from his grandfather, and which was as much a part of his life in this remote taiga hut as morning tea with lingonberry leaves or checking the snares in the evening. He was over 70, but his back was still straight, and his clear, slightly faded blue eyes were attentive and sharp. Wrinkles, like forest paths, furrowed his face, preserving the history of a long, difficult life full of labor, loss, and rare but especially precious joys. His wife, Anushka, had passed away many years ago, taking with her laughter and warmth, leaving a nagging emptiness in his heart that neither the years nor the endless expanses of the taiga could fill. God had not given them children, and now Yegor Matveyevich was alone, like an old cedar tree on top of a hill, steadfastly enduring all adversities. But he did not complain. The forest became his home, his companion, his consolation. He knew every corner of it, every hidden stream, every animal trail. He read the taiga like an open book, understood its language, and respected its laws. On this day, from early morning, he was overcome by a vague uneasiness. The birds were unusually quiet. Even the old owl, which usually hooted at night from a tall pine tree behind the hut, was silent. His faithful dog, Buren, who had died last winter under the paws of a bear, had always sensed the approach of strangers or bad weather in advance. Yegor Matveyevich caught himself listening intently to the sounds outside, although usually his hearing was occupied only by the familiar noises of the forest. He put down his net and went to a small window covered with mica. Snow was falling in sheets, turning the familiar landscape into a blurry white haze. Nothing could be seen more than a few steps away. But that feeling? It itched somewhere inside him, like a splinter. He remembered how his father had taught him. The taiga, son, is alive. Listen to it, and it won't hurt you. But if you don't listen, blame yourself. The old man sighed and rubbed the back of his head. Maybe it was just old age, superstition, but his instincts, honed by decades of living in the wild, rarely failed him. He threw some more wood into the stove and checked that the door was tightly closed. An old double-barreled shotgun hung on the wall above the bench, always loaded with large salt to scare away uninvited animals or even a dangerous person, if necessary. In recent years, the taiga had become restless. Rumors had even reached his secluded hut about escaped convicts and poachers who would stop at nothing. He tried not to think about it, relying on his luck and knowledge of the forest. But today something was wrong. His heart was gripped by an inexplicable anxiety, and even the warmth from the stove could not dispel the inner chill. He went back to the window, peering into the snowy whirlwind. And it seemed to him that, amid the howling wind, he heard a new, unfamiliar sound. The crackling of branches, too frequent and deliberate to be made by an animal. 30 years had passed since that day. But Yegor, then a young, strong 40-year-old hunter, remembered everything as if it had happened yesterday. Autumn was already painting the taiga crimson and gold. The air was fresh and clear, smelling of rotten leaves and mushrooms. He was walking along his trail, checking the snares and traps set for small, furry animals. The day promised to be a good one. A pair of sables were already pulling on the strap of his shoulder bag. He was just turning toward Bear Creek, where he had noticed fresh marten tracks the day before, when his ear caught strange sounds, unusual for this remote corner of the forest. First came a thin, plaintive squeal, full of despair and pain, then rough male laughter and excited voices. Yegor became alert. These were not the sounds of hunting. It was something else. Something wrong, something cruel. His heart sank unpleasantly. He quickened his pace, trying to move as silently as his ancestors, who were hunters, had taught him. There was a smell of smoke from tobacco and something else. Something bitter and unpleasant. The smell of fear. Carefully parting the thick undergrowth of young pine trees, he saw something that made his blood run cold. in a small clearing near a hastily built fire. Two men were fussing over something on the ground. And then he saw it. A small wolf cub, no bigger than a domestic cat, struggling in a steel trap. One of its front paws was caught in the trap's teeth, and drops of blood were staining the snow that had already begun to cover the ground. The wolf cub whimpered and growled at the same time, trying to break free, its little body trembling with pain and terror. The tracks of adult wolves were visible nearby. Apparently, they had been driven away by gunshots or had already become the prey of these people. Poachers, no doubt about it. Their faces were unpleasant, grinning, their eyes darting around. One of them, the taller and uglier one with a sparse red beard, was just raising a heavy stick, preparing to finish off the unfortunate animal. "Look, Mitya, what a nice fur it will make. Just right for your wife's collar," he croaked, and his companion, a stocky, broad-shouldered man, cackled approvingly. Yegor felt his blood boil. He was not a sentimental man. Hunting was his life. But senseless cruelty and mockery of the weak always aroused his fury. He knew the laws of the taiga. Take only what you need to live, do not destroy for no reason. And these weren't hunters. They were thieves, destroyers. He stepped out from behind the fir trees, his old rifle falling habitually into his hand. "Leave the animal alone." His voice sounded firm and authoritative, interrupting their vile merriment. The poachers spun around, their grins fading from their faces, replaced first by surprise, then anger. The one with the stick, a red-bearded man, lowered it, but his eyes narrowed, promising nothing good. "And who are you, smart guy? A forest ranger or something?" he hissed, sizing up Yegor. His companion, Mitya, silently reached for his rifle, which was leaning casually against a tree. Yegor saw the movement out of the corner of his eye, but kept his gaze fixed on the red-bearded man. "It's none of your business who I am. Let the animal go," I said. "It's not right to torment a puppy like that." Yegor tried to speak calmly, but his voice rang with steel. He knew that people like these only understood force. Or what? The red-bearded man took a step forward, his nostrils flaring. "Are you going to tell us what's humane and what's not? We caught him. He's ours." The argument was clearly going nowhere, and Yegor realized that words wouldn't help. He saw greed and cruelty in their eyes. Mitya was already holding his rifle, though he wasn't aiming yet. "Last time, let him go," Yegor repeated, and at that moment he slightly raised the barrel of his rifle, making it clear that he meant business. That was a mistake. The red-bearded man took it as a challenge. "You bastard!" he roared and lunged at Yegor, trying to knock the gun out of his hands. Yegor was ready for this. He dodged the clumsy blow, simultaneously pushing the attacker away with the butt of his gun. At that moment, Mitya raised his rifle, but Yegor spun around and kicked him in the hands. A shot rang out, but the bullet flew into the sky, knocking a cap of snow off a tall fir tree. A short, fierce struggle ensued. Yegor was alone against two, but he was at home, in his taiga. He moved quickly and precisely, each blow well calculated. He did not seek to kill, only to disable and teach a lesson. The red-bearded man, receiving a strong blow to the jaw, flew back toward the fire, knocking over a pot of some kind of gruel. Mitya, trying to reload his rifle, was hit on the fingers with the butt and howled in pain, dropping his weapon. Yegor kicked the knife out of the red-bearded man's hand, who was trying to grab it from behind his boot. The poachers did not expect such resistance from a lone hunter. Their self-confidence quickly evaporated, replaced by fear. Realizing that things were going badly, they cursed and threatened each other and hastily retreated. leaving behind Mitya's rifle and their pitiful spoils. Yegor did not pursue them. He was breathing heavily, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Watching the villains disappear into the thicket, he turned to the wolf cub. It had huddled under the roots of an uprooted tree, looking at Yegor with frightened, pain-filled eyes. Yegor slowly approached, showing that he meant no harm. "Well, little one, you're caught," he said quietly, carefully kneeling down. The task ahead was not easy. To free the paw from the steel trap without causing further harm and without being bitten to death by the frightened animal. He could see that the wolf cub's ear was badly torn, blood oozing from the wound, probably caught on the trap when it was struggling. Yegor acted with extreme caution. His movements were slow and smooth, and his voice was quiet and soothing, as if he were talking not to a wild animal, but to a frightened child. At first, the wolf cub growled and bared its teeth, its little body tense, ready for desperate defense. But there was no threat in Yegor's eyes, only sympathy and a firm determination to help. Gradually, sensing these notes in his voice and behavior, the animal began to calm down, although it was still shaking slightly. Freeing the paw was not easy. The trap's teeth were deeply embedded, and Yegor had to struggle before he could release the spring. The wolf cub yelped when its paw was finally free, but it did not bite, only whimpered pitifully, burying its muzzle in the moss. The paw was badly damaged, bleeding, and it was clear that the bone might be broken. The torn ear also looked bad. Yegor knew that in this condition, the wolf cub would not survive in the taiga. Predators or hunger would quickly finish it off. Without thinking twice, he took off his warm jacket, carefully wrapped the trembling animal in it, and holding his precious burden, headed for his hut, a couple of kilometers away. The journey seemed longer than usual. The wolf cub in his arms would fall silent, then start whimpering again, and Yegor would calm it with soft words, stroking it through the fabric of his jacket. When he brought it to the hut, the first thing he did was carefully wash its wounds with a decoction of taiga herbs, which he always kept on hand. His mother had taught him the wisdom of forest healing. He had to bandage its paw with a clean rag soaked in the same decoction and apply a kind of compress to its ear. Feeding him was a whole other story. At first, the wolf cub refused any food, only glaring hostile at the bowl of warm milk mixed with water and pieces of finely chopped boiled meat. But hunger is a powerful thing, and after a couple of days, he began to eat little by little, cautiously at first, then more and more boldly. Yegor made him a bed in the corner by the stove on an old deer skin. Days passed. Yegor cared for his charge with patience and attention that he might not have shown to a human being. He talked to him, changed his bandages, and made sure he always had fresh water and food. Gradually, the wolf cub, whom Yegor had mentally named Gray because of the color of his fur, began to get used to his savior. He stopped growling when he approached, allowed him to treat his wounds, and even sometimes, when Yegor sat nearby and quietly told him stories, laid his head on his knees, trustingly closing his eyes. The scar on his ear healed, but remained visible, like an eternal mark of that terrible day. His paw was also healing, albeit slowly. Sari began to limp around the hut, curiously sniffing every corner. A silent but strong bond developed between the stern hunter and the wild beast, woven from compassion, trust, and a kind of primitive affection. Yegor caught himself smiling more and more often as he watched his pet's clumsy games or the funny way he wrinkled his nose when sniffing new smells. He had become more than just a rescued animal to him. He had become part of his lonely life. Several months passed. Winter set in, covering the taiga with deep snow. Sari grew stronger and taller, his limp almost gone, only a slight drag on his hind leg remaining, noticeable only to the attentive eye. His fur became thicker and warmer, and the look in his yellow eyes became more meaningful and confident. He was no longer the helpless, frightened puppy that Yegor had brought to his hut. He was a young, strong wolf, ready for life in the wild. Yegor knew he couldn't keep him forever. The hut was too small for a growing predator, and it was no place for a wolf to live alongside humans, no matter how strong their bond. Nature was calling, and instincts took over. Gray approached the door more and more often, sniffing the frosty air coming from outside, and his ears, one of which was adorned with a memorable scar, trembled anxiously. A melancholy expression appeared in his eyes, a call from his ancestors that Yegor could not ignore. The decision was not easy for him. He had grown accustomed to his gray friend, to his silent company. But he knew that it was the right thing to do, that it was the honest thing to do by the animal. On one of those clear, frosty days, when the sun sparkled on the snow like a myriad of diamonds, Yegor made up his mind. He cut up some meat and wrapped it in a skin. Gray, as if understanding that something important was happening, followed him closely, whimpering quietly. Yegor put on his skis, took the bag of meat, and opened the door. "Let's go, Gray. Let's take a walk," he said as if nothing special was happening. They walked for a long time, going deeper and deeper into the forest, where human footprints became increasingly rare. Yegor chose a spot near an old wolf trail that he had known for many years. He stopped, took off his skis, and set the bag down on the snow. Gray approached him and rubbed his muzzle against his leg. Yegor knelt down, hugged the wolf around the neck, and buried his face in its thick fur, which smelled of the forest and snow. "Well, my friend, this is your home now." His voice trembled. "Go. Be free. Remember the good, but live by your own laws." He untied the bag and laid out the meat. Gray looked at the food, then at Yegor, then back at the food. There was something in his eyes that looked like understanding and sadness. Yegor took a few steps back. "Go," he repeated more quietly. The wolf hesitated for a moment, then took a few steps toward the forest, stopped, and turned around. Their eyes met. It was a long, piercing gaze that said everything. Gratitude, farewell, and a promise not to forget. Then Gray turned and disappeared with a light, springy trot among the snow-covered fir trees. Yegor stood there for a long time, watching him go, until the gray shadow finally disappeared into the winter taiga. His heart felt both heavy and light. He had done what he had to do. Returning to the empty hut, he felt that a part of his heart had gone with Gray. And although the years passed, erasing many memories, the image of the young wolf with a scar on his ear and his farewell glance remained forever in the memory of Yegor Matveyevich. He often thought about him, wondering what had become of him, whether he had found a pack and become a leader. And every time he heard the distant howling of wolves coming from the depths of the taiga, he felt that it was Sari sending him his greetings. And now, 30 years later, that old premonition, that inexplicable anxiety, returned, sending a chill down the old hunter's spine when he heard a suspicious crackling of branches outside the window of his secluded hut. The snowy veil parted for a moment, and Kripley saw it. A squat log cabin sunk into the ground, with smoke curling out of the chimney in a thin stream, so inviting and promising. His eyes flashed predatorily. "There it is, our salvation, boys," he growled without turning to his companions. "Stay close behind me, and no nonsense. If anyone's there, tie them up first, then talk." Bake grunted in agreement. his massive fists clenching of their own accord. Schneer nervously licked his parched lips, his gaze darting from the hut to Kripley and back again. They crept up to the building from the leeward side, trying to move as quietly as possible, although the snow crunched treacherously under their holey boots. Horse pressed himself against the wall and listened. All that could be heard from inside was the peaceful crackling of wood in the stove and the faint hum of the wind in the chimney. He cautiously peered through the small, frozen window, wiping it with his sleeve. Inside, by the dim light of the fire in the stove door, he could make out the lone figure of an old man bent over some kind of work. Alone. Old. Easy prey. A smirk touched his thin lips. An old man. He whispered to Bike. "You break down the door. I'll take him. Schneer, you stand by, keep an eye out." Bick nodded, his face expressionless, except for a dull anticipation. He took a couple of steps back, took a running start, and with a wild roar slammed his huge shoulder into the flimsy-looking door. There was a crack as the wood broke, and the door, torn from its makeshift hinges, crashed inside with a bang. Yegor Matveyevich jumped up, instinctively reaching for the rifle hanging on the wall. But he was too late. At the same moment, the door collapsed. The huge figure of Bick appeared in the doorway, followed by Kripley, who glided in like a shadow. "Don't move, old man," barked Kripley, his voice full of menace. Yegor saw the glint of a knife in his hand. The old man froze, realizing that any resistance was now useless and would only worsen his situation. He was old, and there were three of them, young and angry. His heart sank with a sense of foreboding, the same feeling that had tormented him all day, now taking on concrete, terrifying form. He recognized this type of people. Fugitives, desperate, ready for anything. Their eyes burned with a hungry, animal fire. The bull, breathing heavily, loomed over him, his huge body almost completely blocking the doorway. Schneer, looking around cautiously, slipped into the hut and stood against the wall, ready to pounce on the old man at any moment if he tried to resist. "What do you want?" Yegor Matveyevich's voice sounded surprisingly firm, although inside he was frozen with fear. He wasn't going to show them his fear. The man with the scar grinned hoarsely, baring his yellow fangs. "What do we want, old man? What do you think? Warmth, food, and for you to keep your mouth shut if you want to live." His gaze was cold and piercing, like the winter wind. Without a word, the bull roughly grabbed Yegor by the shoulders, his fingers digging in like a vice. The old man tried to break free, but the strength was too unequal. The short, desperate struggle ended quickly. The bull easily twisted his arms behind his back, and the horse one deftly tied them with a piece of rope found nearby in the corner. Yegor was pushed onto a bench against the wall, hitting his shoulder painfully. Meanwhile, the bandits began to ransack his modest dwelling. Schneer, like a hungry rat, rummaged through the shelves, grabbing the old man's few supplies and stuffing them into a bag. A crust of stale bread, a jar of salted mushrooms, and the remains of some dried meat. Bike pushed the old man aside and immediately pounced on the cast-iron pot of cold porridge standing on the stove and began to greedily scoop it up with his hands, slurping and growling with pleasure. Kripley moved more slowly around the hut, carefully examining every corner, his keen gaze searching for anything of value. He tore Yegor's old rifle from the wall, turned it over in his hands, and grunted. "Old, but still usable," he said, and leaned the double-barreled gun against the wall next to him. Yegor Matveyevich silently watched this robbery, his heart bleeding with helplessness and anger. This was not just theft of food and belongings, it was an invasion of his world, a desecration of his home. He saw Kripley approach a small shrine in the corner, where the only thing that was very dear to him stood. an antique icon of the Virgin Mary, a memento of his late wife, Anushka. It had belonged to his great-grandmother, and Yegor cherished it like the apple of his eye. Kripley's hand reached for the icon. "Don't touch it," Yegor Matveyevich blurted out, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "It's sacred." The horseman turned around, an evil grin playing on his face. He took the icon, turned it over in his hands, and clicked his tongue appreciatively. "Sacred, you say? We could use anything sacred right now, old man. Maybe we can sell it somewhere, trade it for some bread." He carelessly shoved the icon into the pocket of his torn jacket. Yegor felt something break inside him. The pain from his beaten shoulder and the humiliation were nothing compared to this new, sharp pain from the loss of the most precious thing he had left. He looked at Kriplog with such hatred that if looks could kill, the bandit would have collapsed dead on the spot. But the latter only curled his lips contemptuously and continued his search, rummaging through Yegor's old things and scattering them on the floor. The hut, which until recently had been a haven of comfort and peace, had been turned into a place of chaos and violence. The smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and malice filled the air, mixing with the smell of smoke and tar. "The icon. Give me back the icon, you bastards." Yegor Matveyevich's voice broke into a hoarse cry, but it was so full of unshakable determination that even Bick, who was still stuffing his belly, froze for a moment and stared at the old man. The horseman slowly turned, his eyes narrowing to slits. He approached Yegor so closely that the old man could smell his foul breath. "Did you say something, old man? The icon. Maybe you want me to sing you a song?" He laughed a short, evil laugh. "Thank your lucky stars you're still breathing. You can pray for your icon if you have time." He looked around the hut again. "Well, Schneer, found anything good?" Schneer wiped his greasy lips on his sleeve after taking a bite from the jar of mushrooms and spread his hands guiltily. "Almost nothing, horse. Some food, a few rags. I'd like some money." Horst nodded, his gaze returning to Yegor. "Come on, old man. Where's your stash? I don't believe that an old man living in the woods has nothing hidden away. Gold? Maybe some old stuff or Soviet rubles?" Yegor remained silent, his lips tightly pressed together. He would rather die than give these scoundrels the little he had saved over many years for a rainy day. The horseman understood this. "If you don't want to do it the easy way, we'll do it the hard way," he hissed and nodded to Bike. The latter, leaving his food, rose eagerly. His face broke into a smug grin. He approached Yegor and struck him several times in the ribs. The old man groaned, but didn't make a sound. "Talk, you old devil," Bika barked, raising his fist for another blow. "Enough." Horst stopped him. "Don't waste your strength. We'll deal with him later. Right now, the main thing is to eat and get some rest. We'll decide what to do with him in the morning." He walked over to the table where Schneer had already laid out their meager spoils. The bandits began to eat, greedily devouring everything they could find. They ate quickly and untidily, like starving animals, arguing over the best pieces. Yegor Matveyevich sat leaning against the cold wall, trying not to show his pain. He looked at them with undisguised contempt. He had seen many people in his life, good and bad, but he had never encountered such blatant baseness and cruelty. After the bandits had eaten their fill, they began to settle down for the night. Harsh took Yegor's bench by the stove. Bull stretched out on the floor, putting some kind of bag under his head, and Schneer, the most cowardly of them, huddled in the far corner closer to the exit, just in case. "What are we going to do with the old man, Ripi?" asked Schneer, his voice trembling with fatigue and vague fear. Creepy looked at Yegor with a long, unreadable gaze. "We don't need any witnesses. We'll spend the night here, and in the morning. In the morning, we won't need him anymore." These words sounded like a death sentence. Yegor understood everything. He was not afraid of death. He had lived a long life. But it was bitter and unfair to die like this, at the hands of these thugs, in his own hut. He closed his eyes, trying to collect his thoughts, to find the strength to meet the inevitable with dignity. Night fell on the taiga, thick and inky, filled with silence, broken only by Bix snoring and the crackling of the cooling coals in the stove. Creep lay with his eyes open, listening to every sound. He didn't trust the silence. He didn't trust anyone, not even his accomplices. Paranoia, a faithful companion of his criminal life, kept him awake. Thoughts of the old man would not leave his mind. Leaving him alive was too big a risk. He could lead them to them, tell them about them. No, the witness had to be eliminated, and as quietly as possible. Strangling was long and noisy. A knife was more reliable. Just before dawn, when sleep was especially deep, he would go up to him and solve the problem with one blow. Creepy grunted with satisfaction and closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Yegor Matveyevich was also awake. The pain in his battered body would not let him forget, and Creepy's words left him no hope. He lay bound on a cold bench, and his whole life flashed before his mind's eye. His childhood in a taiga village, his first steps in hunting with his father, his meeting with Anushka, her smile, their modest happiness, and then her departure and long years of loneliness. He regretted nothing. He had lived his life as best he could, honestly and conscientiously. And if he was destined to die now, then so be it. He only prayed silently that it would happen quickly and that he would not be tortured. He remembered Sari, the wolf he had saved many years ago. I wonder where he is now. Is he still alive? Sometimes Yegor felt that the old story was a dream, something unreal. But the scar on the wolf's ear was too clear to be a figment of his imagination. Deep in the forest, a few kilometers from Yegor's hut, a pack of wolves was following the trail of a large moose. It was led by a seasoned, powerful leader named Gray. His yellow eyes scanned the snow-covered ground intently, his ears alert to the slightest sound. Years had made him wise and cautious. He had led his pack out of dangerous situations many times, saving them from hunger and hunters. A scar on his left ear, a reminder of a long-ago rescue, sometimes reminded him of itself with a slight itch, especially on frosty nights. That night, something was wrong. The moose had gone far away, and the herd was hungry. But that wasn't what worried Gray. He caught a strange, disturbing smell in the air, mixed with the faint but familiar smell of smoke from human dwellings. And something else. Something elusive, causing a vague uneasiness in his wolfish soul. Some ancient, almost forgotten instinct. Some echo from the past. He stopped, raised his head, and sniffed the frosty air. The rest of the pack froze behind him, waiting for the leader's decision. The smell of smoke was coming from the old hut, where, long ago. Gray shook his head, chasing away the unwelcome images. Right now, the pack's hunger was the most important thing. But that smell, it wouldn't leave him alone. He growled softly, giving the signal, and the pack changed direction, slowly moving toward the source of the disturbing smell. Not toward the moose, but toward the smell of smoke and something else. Something alarming and wrong. The pre-dawn twilight had barely begun to dispel the darkness of night when Horse rose silently from his bench. The bull was still snoring loudly, and Schneer was tossing and turning in his sleep, muttering something. Horse froze for a moment, listening. The old man lay still, seemingly asleep. That was good. Horse pulled his homemade knife from his belt, the blade glinting dimly in the semi-darkness. He moved slowly, on tiptoe, toward Yegor. Each step echoed hollowly in his ears. He tried to breathe evenly so as not to betray his excitement. There he was, the old man, so defenseless now. One blow, and it would all be over. No witnesses, no problems. He raised his hand with the knife. Yegor Matveyevich was not asleep. He heard Kripley get up and come closer. He opened his eyes and met the killer's gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, only calm readiness and deep contempt. Kripley hesitated for a moment, surprised by this look. But only for a moment. He was not used to backing down. His hand had already begun to lower when... At that very moment, the silence was broken by a furious, blood-curdling roar. The door, hastily propped against the opening, flew apart with a crash as if struck by a battering ram. And a huge gray wolf burst into the hut like a fury. His eyes burned red in the dim light, the hair on his neck stood on end, and a low, threatening growl escaped from his gaping mouth. Behind him, like shadows, 2 more wolves slipped in. Slightly smaller but no less ferocious. Kripley recoiled, instinctively holding his knife in front of him. The bull, awakened by the noise and animal roars, jumped to his feet, his sleepy face expressing both horror and rage. Schneer squealed and hid in the farthest corner, covering his head with his hands. The leader of the pack, the huge gray wolf, without a moment's hesitation, lunged at the nearest enemy. The bull, who was trying to find something heavy to fight back with. With a powerful leap, the wolf sank his fangs into the gangster's throat. Bick let out a gurgling rattle and collapsed to the floor, choking on his own blood. His huge body twitched convulsively several times and then fell still. It all happened so quickly that Yegor Matveyevich, who was watching the scene with his mouth open, did not immediately understand what had happened. It was like a terrible dream, a vision from ancient legends. But the blood on the floor was real, and so were the wolves' growls. Meanwhile, the second wolf pounced on Schneer. He didn't even try to resist, just squealed and covered himself with his hands. A short, brutal execution, and another gangster fell silent forever. Horse pressed against the wall, he thought feverishly. His knife seemed like a pathetic toothpick against these raging beasts. He saw Yegor's rifle leaning against the wall. It was his only chance. Chaos and primitive rage filled the small hut. The growling of the wolves, the death rattles of the bandits, and the smell of blood and fear mixed into a nightmarish cocktail. Yegor Matveyevich, still tied up, sat on the bench, unable to move. But his gaze was fixed on the leader of the pack, a huge gray wolf that had just finished off Bick. The wolf stood over his defeated enemy, his chest heaving heavily, blood dripping from his fangs. And then Yegor saw it. A jagged scar on the wolf's left ear, clearly visible even in the dim light. The old man's heart stopped, then began to beat wildly. Gray. It was him, the very same wolf cub he had saved and raised 30 years ago. It couldn't be. But the scar was irrefutable proof. His Gray, his taiga godson, had returned. He had returned at the most terrible moment of his life. Taking advantage of the fact that the wolves were busy with his accomplices, Kripley rushed to the rifle. He grabbed the double-barreled gun, clumsily trying to load it. Yegor always kept the cartridges nearby in an old powder flask. But Sari, as if sensing a new threat, turned around with lightning speed. He let out a low, guttural growl and lunged at Kripley, not giving him time to aim. Cripley managed to pull one of the triggers. A deafening shot rang out. The charge of salt, intended to scare off small predators, hit the wolf in the side. Gray howled in pain, but did not retreat. On the contrary, the pain seemed to only fuel his rage. He knocked Horse to the ground, sending the rifle flying to the side. Man and beast rolled across the floor in a deadly struggle. Cripley desperately fought back with his knife, trying to reach the wolf. But Sari was too fast and agile. His fangs sought the bandit's throat. Yegor saw the knife flash, the wolf dodge, and attack again. It was a battle not for life, but for death. The other two wolves, having dealt with Schneer, stood at a distance, not interfering in the leader's duel, but ready to come to his aid at any moment. Yegor Matveyevich forgot about his pain and fear. He watched the fight, and in his soul, horror and some strange, wild triumph struggled. Justice was being served. Cruel, bloody, but justice nonetheless. Taiga justice. He saw how Horse began to weaken, his knife blows becoming less and less accurate. Gray, despite the wound in his side from which blood was oozing, was relentless. He found the moment when Horse opened up, and his fangs closed on the bandit's neck. A short, gurgling cry, and it was all over. Horse went limp, his knife falling from his weakened hand. The leader of the pack, Gray, stood over the body of his last enemy, breathing heavily. His side was covered in blood, but he stood straight, powerful and menacing. The silence, broken only by his heavy breathing and the quiet whimpering of one of the wolves, weighed heavily on the hut. Yegor Matveyevich looked at Gray, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks, tears of shock, relief, and some incredible, almost mystical gratitude. He couldn't believe his eyes. The wolf he had once saved from certain death had returned 3 decades later to save him. It was more than a coincidence. It was fate. It was the very taiga debt whispered about in old legends. Sari slowly turned his head and looked at Yegor. Their eyes met. There was no longer any fury in the wolf's yellow eyes, only a deep, almost human understanding and recognition. He took a few steps toward the old man, stopping at arm's length. Yegor saw the scar on his ear, saw the fresh wound on his side, saw the wisdom and strength in his gaze. "Gray," Yegor whispered, his voice trembling. You recognize me." The wolf whimpered softly, as if in response, and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he came even closer and gently, almost weightlessly, nudged the old man's bound hand with his large, wet muzzle. It was a touch full of tenderness and devotion, just like back then, many years ago when he was a small, frightened puppy. Yegor felt a warm wave wash over his body, washing away the last remnants of fear and pain. He was no longer alone. He had a friend, the most loyal and unexpected friend one could imagine. The other two wolves approached the leader, quietly sniffing his wound, expressing their concern. Gray growled briefly, calming them down. Then he looked at Yegor again, with a long farewell glance. It was clear that their mission here was over. They had come, they had done justice, and now they had to leave. Gray let out a quiet, low howl, not a battle cry, but rather a signal to retreat. And the pack, as silently as it had appeared, slipped out of the destroyed hut one by one, disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom of the taiga. Gray was the last to leave. He paused for a moment in the doorway, glanced once more at Yegor, and in his eyes the old man saw not only farewell, but also a promise. A promise that the taiga remembers everything, and that good always returns, even if it takes years. When the last sounds of the wolves' paws faded into the morning silence, Yegor Matveyevich was left alone among the bodies of his tormentors. The hut was destroyed, the air was thick with the smell of blood and death. But the old man felt a strange calm, almost peace. He was alive. Beaten, tortured, but alive, and saved in the most incredible way. Overcoming the pain in his bound hands and aching ribs, he managed to free himself from the ropes. The bandits had tied him hastily and not very skillfully. First, he went to the place where Kripley had dropped the icon of the Virgin Mary during his struggle with the wolf. It lay on the floor, face down, covered with sawdust. Yegor carefully picked it up, brushed off the dust, and pressed it to his chest. The icon was intact. It was another miracle of that terrible morning. Then he went to the window. The sun was just beginning to rise above the snow-covered tops of the fir trees, painting the sky with delicate shades of pink and gold. A new day was dawning, dispelling the nightmares. The taiga stood silent and majestic, washed by fresh snow as if nothing had happened. But Yegor Matveyevich knew that something had happened. Something had happened that would forever change his life and his attitude toward this harsh but fair world. He stepped outside his hut and took a deep breath of the frosty, clean air. The pain in his body was still there, but it no longer seemed so sharp. The main thing was that he was alive, and he was not alone. He had his taiga, his silent protector, and he had the memory of Sari, the wolf who had paid his debt in full. He knew he would never forget that night. And he knew that from now on he would look at the wolves howling in the forest with completely different eyes. It would not be just the voice of a wild beast. It would be the voice of his savior, his taiga brother. There was much to do. He had to tidy up the hut and bury the uninvited guests far from the house so as not to attract other predators. But now Yegor Matveyevich just stood and looked at the rising sun, feeling his heart fill with quiet, deep gratitude. Gratitude to life, to fate, to the wolf with a scar on his ear, who reminded him that even in the most remote taiga, in the most desperate situation, there is room for miracles, for loyalty, and for that invisible bond that connects all living things on this earth. The cold wind of the taiga now seemed different to him. It no longer carried a threat, but whispered ancient legends of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable laws of nature.